Hello, my friends. We are continuing with guidelines for conduct for members of the Ananda Sevaka order, the Ananda way of life. We are up to Article 8 of 16 articles, which is more than halfway through the book because they are of uneven length. And this one is work is service. So let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to be constantly aware that you are always watching over us, that you are ever present to offer guidance and support and love if we are able to receive it. Help us to let down all self-concern, all defensiveness, all fear, that you can flow into us and guide us with your perfect love. We are your children. Bring us home to thee. Om, peace. Amen. I often say, we are your children, bring us home. I mean, what mother would leave their children at the grocery store or wherever else they would leave them? Of course, they would bring them home. I only remember once, and I'm sure every child has the memory, when your parents were supposed to pick you up and they forgot. It happened to me only once that I remember. I never thought they wouldn't come. It was interesting. A friend of mine adopted a child, not as a baby, but as a toddler, or maybe even older than that. It was a foreign adoption from another country. The child might have even been 4 or 5 before she came to the family. And of course, there was a child who's adopted from another country has already been abandoned at least once. And depending on the age, how much of a memory they have of that. So the biggest issue was for the adopted little girl to really trust that her American parents were completely committed to her, which they were. And then somehow on a family trip, and I'm not quite sure how it happened, they got separated, and I don't think they actually drove off, but maybe they almost drove off, and the child was left there for a brief period of time, not knowing where the parents were. Let me think if I can say this correctly. But when they went back and got the girl, she was furious with them, because how dare they leave her behind? She belonged to them, and they should bring her wherever they go. And the parents thought that was such a tremendous victory, because the child, now felt that this was my right to belong to you. And it was like a watershed moment. And oddly, they'd left her, but it was not that she felt she should be abandoned. It was she had a right not to be. And she grew up to be a very healthy, fine woman, too. Isn't that interesting? But just that parental child, and I've been saying that same prayer for such a long time, and recently it's occurred to me that it's kind of a ridiculous prayer. Where else would your parents take you except home? They would bring you home, because that's where you belong. And that little girl's temper is exactly the right response. This is what you have to do. I belong to you. Master talked about one of his disciples who was very, very devoted, but also very difficult. And Master described him as a mouthful of hot molasses, too hot to swallow, but too sticky to spit out. And Master could be very frank. He didn't feel the need to sort of be delicate about saying who people were. but it was a compliment, you know. He's difficult, he's his strange karma, which he did. He had commotion karma, is how Master called it. But he was absolutely devoted to Master. And in fact, Master said he would attain liberation in that lifetime, even though if you looked at him, you wouldn't have thought, he didn't match the image. But devotion is everything. Swami talks about the same exchange with Master, about one of the disciples who'd been born with cerebral palsy, which can leave your mind and your personality completely intact, but it can make it very hard, the connection between your brain and your physical body in terms of movement can be severely interrupted. So this man moved in an exceedingly awkward way, and he had a very difficult time with speech as well. But he was completely intact. This is a very interesting thing to remember about people whose brains don't work properly or whose bodies don't work properly. I mean, in his case, his brain was working perfectly well, but he couldn't get from his brain, he couldn't get his words out. Nowadays, with computer communication, people are discovering that often someone who isn't able to communicate may be, magnificently intact internally, and the computers provide the link that the body doesn't provide. Other people who are mentally impaired, their soul is not impaired. It's just their brain that's impaired, and therefore they don't perceive this world in the way that most people perceive it. But their intelligence, their fundamental intelligence, and their spirituality can be untouched by it. It's just the brain makes them appear differently than that. It's an extremely important point to keep in mind when we regard people and how we treat them, and just in every respect. But because, I'm not quite sure how I got all the way to there, but I was talking about how the Master will take care of us. And mothers and fathers, everything in this world is a symbol of a higher reality. And the unconditional self-sacrificing love of the mother and the father is to tell us what kind of love is possible, and to show us what kind of love is possible for us to express. Any great love is there to give us a hint of the satisfaction, of the fulfillment that comes from being an instrument of that kind of selfless dedication. So now, let's go on with our work section. And this is just laying out what kind of a community Ananda has. It's not entirely applicable if you're not living in community, but parts of it are. Ananda members living in a residential community are free both to create their own businesses and to import businesses from outside the community. What we're talking about is personal initiative is both respected and encouraged within the community. We don't just sit within Ananda and wait for someone else to tell us what to do. It's both allowed and encouraged to be entrepreneurs on our own. And this is a very important definition of what Ananda is, because there are communities in which everyone moves in lockstep together and decisions are made by perhaps one appointed board of directors, and personal initiative is not encouraged. This is also a very Kali Yuga attitude toward how do you overcome the ego as you suppress it. This is not the Dwapara Yuga attitude. Swamiji talks about that in many different places, in the Renunciation for the New Age book, A New Renunciate Order for the New Age, and also the book Sadhu Beware, that to try to overcome the ego by suppressing it is a Kali Yuga method, whereas the Dwapara Yuga method is to learn to express not your egoic self, but let the divine flow through you. But then the ego is transcended because of the dynamic flow of inspired energy rather than by cutting off the flow and hoping to starve it out that way. Suppression is not transcendence. It's possible that restraint can also lead to transcendence, but too often, unfortunately, restraint does not lead there. It leads only to suppression. And so we're not really free of it. We've just sort of frightened it into the corner, but it's often just waiting there to emerge again. Transcendence is when we have an experience of ourselves on a higher level of reality, and we, on our own, just simply relinquish the lower level of reality. That egoic satisfaction is no satisfaction compared to the fulfillment that comes to us when we make ourselves instruments of a superconscious flow of energy. So encouraging personal initiative is also it's an indicator of what the whole path of self-realization as it is practiced by Ananda, what it looks like. You can create your own business. You can bring a business in that you already have. What you do is not the definition of who you are. How you do it, with what vibration, with what consciousness, with what attitude, that's what defines you. And that principle transfers to any living situation that you're in. Whatever you're doing, do it as an instrument of God. And I would recommend to you, if you're not already familiar with the teaching of the 8 manifestations of God, you can go onto my YouTube channel and just type in 8 manifestations of God. I believe I did a whole series of morning broadcasts on these. I believe I did, but now it was months ago. But it's a very helpful way. It's one of the most helpful ways to understand how to be an instrument of higher consciousness. It takes it from an abstraction to specific, identifiable, accessible attitudes. And because there's 8 attitudes of the divine, 8 manifestations, one of them always works. If you're not calm, you can always be energetic. If you're not energetic, you can be peaceful. If you're not feeling peaceful, perhaps you can feel joy. If you're, anyway, on and on. You can see how it can work together. So let's move on. Members are free as well to pursue their own personal careers, whatever that might be. You know, doctors or attorneys or whatever work happens to, mechanics, machinists, whatever work suits you. I mean, one of the, a number of the very fine members of Ananda who are even resident in Ananda communities. Before worked, one man worked at just a local manufacturing company. It was a work he really loved. CPA, carried out his career for a long time. Now with the advent of computers, one man who lives at Ananda Village holds a very important position with the University of California at Davis. He works through their computer system, and he can do it just as well from anywhere in the world. And this is completely consistent with the Ananda way of life, because we all have different karma. And it also enriches the community for people to have many different experiences. And it also makes people independent in ways that are very important, self-sufficient in ways that are important. So we're not all just sitting there waiting for the community to provide jobs and to take care of us. It becomes a very top-heavy entity if that's what happens, and people become passive in ways that are not healthy. And one more piece of it, which Swamiji was very concerned about. In traditional monasteries, it would unfortunately too often happen that people would come in with a lot of enthusiasm, but gradually would lose their vocation. In Catholic terms, that means the divine call to be a monastic fades out of their life. And in another context, Swami made the comment that only a few people have lifelong spiritual karma. For many, many people, they're very seriously interested, but that karma lasts only for a time. And when it expires, their own destiny just takes them somewhere else. So thus, over the many decades of Ananda, literally thousands of people have passed through. And only hundreds have stayed of thousands who have passed through, either as residents or in other involvement. And that's not necessarily a sign of failure. Maybe just the rhythm of the time. This is as far as I'm able to take it now. I have to work out karma in other ways before I'll be able to come back to it. No, I'm not encouraging a casual attitude toward embracing a spiritual life and then dropping it for superficial reasons, but it does happen. But when you're living in a religious community where you have no financial independence and no capacity to generate the energy to run your own life, you have to stay because you're afraid to leave. And you have no life skills that would enable you to leave. And so, unfortunately, historically, you often end up in a monastic order with some very unhappy, bitter people who have just literally become trapped. And Swamiji organized Ananda from the very beginning with a profound awareness of that and a strong desire to establish Ananda in such a way that people, even to the end of their lives, it would always be a free choice, not an economic or a social necessity. So he said they are free as well to pursue their own personal careers. No gainful activity should be admitted into Ananda, however, without the approval of the appropriate community leaders. So once again, Swami does not set up an exact criteria or a complicated bureaucratic process. He just says, if you're going to bring a business into Ananda, talk to others about it. Talk to people who have experience and are responsible to the community just to make sure you're not missing something. And giving them a chance to encourage or to redirect if they feel it would be in your best spiritual interest to do it. All the way through this, especially when I was talking about marriage and children, I was reaffirming what Swami says right at the very beginning. Community life is not consistent with too excessive a determination to be independent. We are joining a community because we want to be part of a community. So Swami's just reminding us, if you're going to bring something in, if you're going to bring an enterprise in that will employ others, or even that you will only be working on it yourself, talk to people about it. Just make sure you're not missing something here, and that they can be helpful to you in supporting it. The main focus of such approval should be on the compatibility of the proposed activity with Ananda's ideals. And it's most likely that if someone is resident there, they will be in tune enough with the ideals that it will happen. In a community of vegetarians, for example, raising pigs to be slaughtered for meat is not going to be a very good idea. Or in being involved in some enterprise where the application of your efforts might not be consistent with other ideals that you may have, or any enterprise that is dishonorable in the way it carries itself out. Now, of course, people can draw the lines in different places, but this is what we're thinking about. The emphasis in this case should be positive. In other words, in the spirit of openness, almost any new activity should be accepted, provided the activity doesn't contradict Ananda's ideals. So that's the basic premise. I know one man brought in and ran for a while. Am I correct in this? I think it was an advertising agency or something like that. I feel like I'm not quite accurate, but it was something to do with the advertising field. Some people could argue that there was a moral issue there, but it would be drawing the lines pretty narrowly. So he was encouraged, and several people worked for him for a number of years, and it was a good enterprise. It was honorably run, and it was a good enterprise. The attitude should be, if at all possible, say yes. And so Swami's not only guiding how the principles work in the community, but he's also guiding those in positions of responsibility. How do I think about this? If at all possible, say yes. I mean, it's an important point because some organizations are governed either by individuals or by a philosophy that says, first say no, and then see if somebody can persuade us to say yes. It's a very, very, very bad attitude. If we find ourselves consistently thinking of why it won't work, we really need to re-examine our orientation to life, because we should always approach things with a positive feeling. And then, of course, not everything is practical. We shouldn't be naive in our affirmations, but we should try as much as possible to be supportive and say yes if we possibly can. I remember I worked with a woman for a time many decades ago, and her ideas were often not practical, and her ideas were often self-serving, or at least oriented toward her biases rather than objective in her appraisal. And for a while I developed a very unfortunate habit of, whenever she would bring up one of these thoughts, which I knew it didn't have a chance of ever really getting anywhere, I would immediately say no. And naturally, that created a lot of conflict. And I began to listen to my own teaching, and after a while, I just flipped it around. It completely changed our relationship, which is whatever she would say, I would start by thinking about the good features about it. And it wasn't a technique. I wasn't trying to trick her by being positive before I said no. I remember one of the managers at Ananda came to Swami once and said that he'd read a management book, and it said, if you're going to have to criticize someone, first tell them 2 things you really like about what they're doing. And the manager thought this was a really good plan. Swami said, that's so manipulative. He said, and any sensitive person is going to see through it right away. As soon as you start complimenting them, they'll just start waiting for the blow to strike. Now, that's quite different than actually thinking about what's good, about what's been said to you. So I realized that this woman had good intentions, she just wasn't practical. So whenever she presented an idea to me, I would pick out the parts of it that were positive and comment perhaps about what I could feel she was trying to accomplish, which was all true. And then we would sort of start talking through where the shortcomings might be. And invariably, in the end, I had to say, we're not going to be able to do that. But it was entirely different than when I just said no, because my whole orientation then sounded like that my desire was always to say no. But it isn't. My desire is to say yes whenever it's practical. So this is what Swami's encouraging in us. And again, here, this is a universal principle. It doesn't have anything to do with living in a community. For in truth, virtually any business can have a spiritual influence if the people who serve it do so in the consciousness of God. For in truth, virtually any business can have a spiritual influence if the people who serve in it do it in the consciousness of God. Now, this also makes us happy to do humble work. This broadens the basis of what we can say yes to. It's not what we're doing, it's the consciousness that we bring to it. When Swamiji was in the throes of being expelled from SRF, which happened to him in 1962, and at that time he was serving on the board of directors, he was the head monk, he was the main minister, he had many very visible public functions and titles that went with it. And Swamiji's desire, he hadn't solicited any of those positions. It was his natural talent that brought him to them. Master had put them in those positions, or he had been elevated since Master's passing 10 years previously. But when his behaviors was considered unacceptable, and members of the board of director wished to separate him from the organization altogether, he volunteered to give up every position that he had, every title, every position of status. He said, "You can put it in writing that I will do nothing but wash dishes for the rest of my life." But the nemesis, the board of directors member who was Swami's nemesis, who was leading the charge to expel him, said, "No, I know you too well. If you become the main dishwasher in a very short period of time, washing dishes will be the most important job in SRF." And Swami said he couldn't dispute that point, because he knew that whatever he did, he would approach it with so much enthusiasm, so much joy, and so much devotion to serving Master in whatever way was open to him, that the sheer magnetism of what he was doing would draw others into it. And that's the principle. You can have a spiritual influence if whatever you do it with the consciousness of God. And everyone will want to be with you, because that's what we're all seeking. We're all seeking to be aware of the presence of God. And you can have all the titles in the world, and if you're not useful to people, no one will ever seek you out. I know I've told the story before of a woman who worked for me who wanted to have approval over the project as it went along, but she was very difficult to work with. And she wanted me to make a rule that everybody had to consult her at a certain stage of the project so that nothing could go forward without her approval. And she was actually quite talented and had a lot to offer, but she was just very difficult to work with. People did not feel happy because of her influence. And I told her I could make every rule in the world, and I promise you that the people of Ananda especially, who are trained to take personal initiative, they'll all find a way to go around you. And then I won't have any power to, even though I have authority, I won't actually have any power to make them. You have to make yourself so magnetic that people want to work with you. And this is what he's saying here. Any business, any job can have a spiritual influence if you carry it out in the consciousness of God. And what does that mean above all? That means that you love people. I mean, that's what the consciousness of God is. What is it that we feel when we feel that we have an experience of the divine presence? We feel it inside ourselves. And we feel it as, it just makes us feel so good. It makes us so happy to be me, and not me in the egoic, important sense. But we discover who I really am. We come to peace. We come to peace with reality as it is. And if we wish to have a spiritual influence, that's what the spiritual influence is. It's not that people say, "Oh, you're so smart, you're so wise." It's that they feel happy in our company. That's what Swamiji was. Sometimes when people would say to describe him, I would say it was so much fun. But fun, as Swami himself described it, is to feel close to God and to share that closeness with others. And that's what it was with Swami. You just felt you were right where you were supposed to be, that there was no place else in the world that you wanted to be, that you were completely content to be who you are. I don't mean you were complacent, but just everything was right, because that was the consciousness he had. He had the consciousness of God, and where else would I want to be? Okay, my friends, God bless you.